Ken Kaneki. Probably one of the most interesting characters in all in anime and manga, and also, I would say, probably one of the best written. Now, I'm not saying that Kaneki is definitively the best, because I would definitely say that there's multiple different characters out there probably better written than Kaneki as a whole, based off of the way how their story is overall written, as well as the way how they're executed, like in the case of Guts from Berserk. But even though I say that Kaneki might not nearly be as fleshed out as someone like Guts, or even be as layered as him, that definitely doesn't mean that as a whole Kaneki isn't a good or well-written character on his own right. Enough so, where I feel like multiple different people within the Tokyo Ghoul fandom have their own interpretation of what Ken Kaneki is, and what exactly he represents. And I would even go far enough to say, with the adaptation of Tokyo Ghoul, as well as Tokyo Ghoul Re, and the way how they fleshed out Kaneki and presented him in a different way, kinda showcases this to be the fact, where Studio Pierrot didn't realize that of how Kaneki is supposed to be characterized, and they kind of messed up on his character as a whole because that was their interpretation of him. Now, you could also chalk this up to saying that Tokyo Ghoul Re simply just didn't have a very good adaptation, which definitely is indeed true, but you could also kind of look at it from a more positive aspect where Kaneki is just that complex, where a studio that has been able to produce multiple different anime and manga that has been very well received isn't able to understand a character like Kaneki. Now, you can look at this from many different retrospects. The fact that Kaneki is only as complex as he is due to the several different personalities that he actually has and has showcased throughout the course of the story, but you could also say that even if you are looking at Kaneki in multiple different individuals, for example, looking at white-haired Kaneki in contrast to Heisei Sasaki, each and every version of Kaneki as a whole kind of feels like their own separate character, which just adds to his overall complexity. And this even adds a lot more when it comes to the overall aspect of the way how the Tokyo Ghoul story is structured and the way how each character is showed off. The fact that every single person has their own perspective on the way how the world should be, as well as the way how they currently try to live through the world and simply try to survive. And that is the main story and main theme of the Tokyo Ghoul story, which is survival. And the fact of people taking responsibility for the way how the world is, whether or not it's their fault or it's because of the way how the world already is. Now, I can already tell, based off of the things that I've said so far in this video, that somebody is going to come down below and say, well, Tokyo Ghoul isn't nearly as good as we originally thought due to the way how it ended. Sui Ishida promised us a tragedy, but in the end, we ended up not getting one, we ended up getting a happy ending. But in many regards, even though from a meta standpoint, we all know that Sui Ishida did change his original ending. He has stated this multiple different times, like on Twitter, as well as in the own manga volume due to several different things, like the fact that he was depressed, and also the fact that he was becoming very burnt out due to writing the Tokyo Ghoul story for almost an entire decade. Now, for this reason alone, I wouldn't say that this completely belittles the story. You kind of have to just look at the Tokyo Ghoul story from a different aspect. Now, if you already knew that Tokyo Ghoul was going to have a happy ending going into the story, now, this is up for debate whether or not this is good storytelling or not. I would actually say that it probably isn't, and not something that I would suggest to anybody, but you can kind of just look at it from a different regard, looking at the way how Kaneki spoke in the very first chapter at the very end of it after his unfortunate circumstance with Rize, when him saying that if he wrote a story with me as the lead protagonist, it'd certainly be a tragedy. There's two different regards that you can kind of take it. One, Kaneki's life did end in a tragedy. Not only did Kaneki have to come to terms with all the things that he did to multiple different innocent people during the events of the Dragon Arc, the fact that he killed multiple innocent people, not to mention it has even caused some of his friends to end up dying due to him being very uncertain of his own actions. You can even look at it from the different aspect of Kaneki from the very get-go was very suicidal. He didn't have any type of appreciation of life. To him, life was nothing more than something very boring, something that he simply had to strive through, not something that he could really enjoy. And even though this theme does carry out throughout the course of the majority of the Tokyo Ghoul story, you can even say that the story of Tokyo Ghoul is Kaneki coming into terms with everything that's happened, and him learning how to appreciate life. Very similar to the character arc that I think someone like Mikasa Ackerman might end up going through throughout the course of Attack on Titan. Now, Kaneki as a whole, I think, is a very interesting character, from the aspect of, even prior to the event of the story, multiple things happened to Kaneki that kind of caused him to end up being the blank slate that we see him in the very first chapter of the manga. Nothing out of the ordinary, simply looking like an ordinary or normal college student that is hanging out with his friend Hide in a cafe, observing and listening to the news, finding out that there are monsters known as ghouls throughout the course of the world. Now, I will probably make a separate video talking about Tokyo Ghoul in general, kind of looking back at it as an overall retrospective, but there's different things when it comes to Tokyo Ghoul that we all need to consider. For one, when it comes to Tokyo Ghoul, ghouls aren't really something that are extremely common, despite them being a pretty large portion of the population, which might seem a little bit contradictory to what I just said. They don't go around attacking people in broad daylight to the point where multiple people know what ghouls look like. I mean, even look at the way how Kaneki and Hide talk in the very first chapter. They make it out to be as if they've never seen a ghoul in their first life, or in their entirety of their life, which, I mean, obviously due to the fact that ghouls look almost the exact same as humans, for the most part, aside from them having a Kagune sac, as well as being able to produce a Kakugan, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between ghouls and humans, and I feel like that's the main thing that caused a conflict within Kaneki when he first ended up becoming a ghoul. You're brought up your entire life living in a world filled with ghouls. Monsters that you don't really know about, ones that you haven't really seen, ones that you only have mystery and questions about how exactly they look and even how they act. Then you come to the shocking realization of confronting a ghoul for the first time, someone who you ended up thinking was very cute, and someone that you could have ended up potentially loving, and you end up becoming a ghoul because of this person indirectly. It's definitely a shocking revelation when you come to terms to the fact that you are a ghoul, and I think that's also one of the main impacts and one of the main reasons why the Kaneki vs. Jason fight is so powerful, due to the fact that it took Kaneki over 60 chapters to even come to the realization of what exactly he was. And that is a ghoul, or in his eyes, a monster. And I think that's why for everything after the events of the Jason arc, Kaneki kind of acts very different compared to the beginning of the Tokyo Ghoul story. Now, before I completely jump the gun and jump into the way how white-haired Kaneki acts, I would like to spend a little bit more time focusing on black-haired Kaneki, because this is the first Kaneki that we see throughout the course of the Tokyo Ghoul story, not necessarily the first one in the timeline though, but is the one that kind of gives us our main retrospective of the way how Kaneki acts and his overall life views and fundamentals of the way how he acts. For lack of a better term, Kaneki, black-haired Kaneki at least, is kind of the embodiment of what someone would consider a beta male, someone who lacks the will to fight on their own, as well as the fact that they lack multiple different values or even traits that would allow them to stand up against somebody who would consider having a more dominant personality than them. Not only that, but this version of Kaneki is probably the most human. Not only does he have multiple different values that could be interpreted as weak to ghouls, like the fact that he doesn't really like killing other humans, despite them coming for his life and potentially jeopardizing his survival as well as his own friend's survival, you have where this version of Kaneki believes the mentality of what his mother supposedly gave to him. And that is, it's better to be hurt than hurt others. Now, at first glance, and after reading the entirety of the Tokyo Ghoul story, both part 1 and part 2, a lot of people might question where did Kaneki end up getting these beliefs from? Where exactly did they come from? Where did they stem from? And why exactly were they formed due to the way how his mother actually was, which, spoiler alert, if you didn't see the giant spoiler title that I actually have in the very beginning of this video, Kaneki's mother ended up abusing him quite a bit. In fact, it's painfully obvious to see that Kaneki's mother was the one who actually planted the first seeds of Kaneki's further on abusive life and lifestyle onto him before anyone else even did. And Kaneki, for the most part, you can actually say, was broken before the Tokyo Ghoul story even began. Now, from my point of view, I think Kaneki ended up developing this belief, the fact that it's better to be hurt than hurt others, due to the way how his mother spoke to him, as well as the way how she constantly beaten him. This was more of a reflect of the way how Kaneki was treated, the constant abuse, and not to mention he was a child and very impressionable for him to come to terms of what exactly was happening to him, and him finding some way to comfort himself and come up with some type of excuse to justify why his mother was beating him the way how she was. Now, it's really hard to say how much about Kaneki's mother that we've seen throughout the course of the story is actually true, due to the fact of Kaneki having multiple different problems when it comes to his overall personality, as well as multiple different lies that lie within his own personality. Not to mention, due to the severe brain damage that we've seen throughout the course of the story that Kaneki tends to have, it's pretty arguable to say that Kaneki's memories aren't necessarily the 100% facts or truth. And in fact, we probably don't have an accurate measure of what Kaneki's mother really was. Based off of the memories that we've seen Kaneki actually show throughout the course of the Tokyo Ghoul story, not him directly talking to anyone and telling them this, more on the lines of the fact of how we see Kaneki throughout the small flashbacks that we get to see of him during the events of the Eto fight. We get to see that Kaneki, when in his childhood, seemingly was very greedy. Now, we also do know from some aspects that Kaneki's mother was a very hard worker. Now, whether or not the theory that Kaneki was the main cause of his mother's death due to him potentially directly killing her is up for debate. We don't really know whether or not that's canon or not, but I would actually argue and say that's probably not, and just more on the lines of a fan theory, kind of similar to what Jason did to Kaneki during his torture. But if we go with the aspect that Kaneki was very greedy as a child, and that's why his mother would constantly beat him, then you can kind of look at it from the regard of Kaneki being greedy is what caused him to hurt his mother, and for that reason alone, he didn't want to cause any more pain to anyone else, because he would think that him causing pain to someone would potentially end up causing them to die, regardless of them being a person that he might have loved, but caused a lot of harm to him. And it kind of goes back to the overall aspect of what people have said about Kaneki before, like on the lines of Eto, saying that Kaneki is beaten a lot by the people that he loves most, which this is reflected quite a bit with his relationship with Toka, funny enough. Now, for the most part, I would actually say that this aspect to Kaneki, the fact that this ends up leading to his overall kindness, and the fact that a lot of people end up growing very fond of Kaneki, not only because of the fact that he is an artificial half-ghoul, which is something that is considered relatively rare, back then at least. The fact that Kaneki was very kind, not to mention he was very intelligent, was one thing that did draw a lot of people to him, like characters like Hinami, Toka, Tsukiyama, and many others ended up being drawn to Kaneki due to his kindness and his very passive nature. Now, people have been irritated by this before in the past, like Toka or even Nishio, but I think through time and the way how Kaneki's acted, the fact that he's showed them a different aspect of the ghoul world, and it's not necessarily as bad as it really was, at least the way how it was interpreted to be for the longest time in the story, allowed people to kind of accept Kaneki as a whole for the way how he was, and it's really sad to see when Kaneki finally snaps. Throughout the course of Volume 1 through Volume 7 of the original Tokyo Ghoul manga, we get to see the overall transition of Kaneki. The fact that he slowly gets to see two different aspects of the overall world. One aspect of the fact that the human world isn't nearly as bright and fun as he originally perceives it to be, and you even get to see the other aspect that the ghoul world is a lot more beautiful than what humanity makes it seem to be. Now, at first you would think that this translation shouldn't really be one that would be that jarring. It's very easy to come to terms with something like that. The fact that the world is not black and white, and in reality it's filled with more shades of gray, is something that every single story seems to try to tell in multiple different mediums. But in the case of someone like Kaneki, who originally had a very closed-minded view, and having to witness several different things that no person should have to experience throughout the course of their entire life, like in the case of Kaneki having to witness Hinami's mother get killed right in front of him, and he couldn't really do anything more than just shield Hinami's vision, so she wouldn't have to witness something like that. Not to mention the fact of the way how he was brutally tortured by the hands of Jason, and due to his own kindness and the fact that he wouldn't want to cause the pain to anyone else, he ended up causing the worst pain possible to some of the victims that were pulled into the entirety of the situation. The fact that multiple bodies were placed on Kaneki due to his own frailness and his own weakness, it's what caused Kaneki to overall snap and accept his overall ghoul side, the side that he considered a monster. To Kaneki, his humanity was the most precious thing to him. It was what made him human, and it's what made him good, as well as tied back to his kindness. In multiple different regards, you can actually see Kaneki looking at his ghoul side, not not just only as a monster, but also as something that he couldn't control, and even something as him forsaking his old self, his overall values, and what exactly he deemed originally as good or evil. Not only to other people within the Tokyo Ghoul world was Kaneki's human side seen as something like a weakness, but to Kaneki in this situation, he knew if he continued to quote-unquote act human, he wouldn't be able to get the things that he needed to done. The people that he would care about would eventually end up dying, and he'd be nothing more than something else to blame, very similar to what happened with his own mother, as well as Hinami's mother, and even the event of both the mother and the child that were unfortunately brought into Jason's torture room that day. So after coming to terms with all of this, and even speaking to the interpretation of Rize within his own mind, his ghoul side, Kaneki came to terms with the fact that he's a ghoul, and he overall welcomed and embellished the entirety of the monster that would be considered his ghoul abilities, and ended up curb-stomping Jason quite easily in their overall scuffle. Now, I would say for the most part, even though Kaneki does go through multiple different transitions throughout the course of the story, I'm unfortunately going to have to cut this kind of in half. This will probably end up being a two-part video due to the fact of Kaneki, for the most part, having two interpretations of the way how he views his life throughout the course of Tokyo Ghoul Part 1 as well as Part 2, so expect a sequel video to come very shortly. But before I wrap up this video entirely, there is one thing that I would like to say when it comes to the way how Kaneki is shown throughout the course of the Tokyo Ghoul Part 1 manga. Like I said in the very beginning of this video, the way how Studio Pierrot, as well as the way how Sui Ishida interpreted Kaneki's character was very different. The events of Tokyo Ghoul Route A obviously did not happen in the manga, and it's already been deemed by the fandom as either non-canon or anime original. Now, like I said before, the events of Tokyo Ghoul Route A did not happen in the manga, but similar events did happen in the manga that sort of play some type of parallel to what was shown within the anime interpretation. Kaneki still does go through some type of journey on his own. Now, in the anime version, he ended up joining Aogiri Tree, which hypothetically would be a very interesting interpretation of Kaneki's story, but it wasn't executed perfectly, obviously. I don't really have any ill feelings towards Tokyo Ghoul A, but I don't really think it's great either. You could actually argue and say that Studio Pierrot's interpretation of Kaneki comes across as a lot more heroic, and even though Kaneki is still somewhat of a martyr, it's kind of playing a more anti-hero story with Kaneki, whereas in the manga, it's very obvious that Kaneki was completely consumed by revenge. Not only did he want to get back at Aogiri for all the horrible things that they did to him as well as his own friends, he also wanted to get back at Dr. Kano, rightfully so, for what he did to him in turning his body and even screwing up his life way more than it originally was. Now, like any other revenge story, you can actually say for the most part, most revenge stories end up very badly. Not on the lines of the way how they're written, but more on the lines of the fact that with revenge, you don't really end up winning anything. You either end up becoming very empty due to the circumstances that are thrown right before you, or you end up just failing as a whole and throwing your life aside and not being able to redeem that fact. The fact that you ended up sacrificing yourself for literally no cause. Now, fortunately enough, despite Kaneki becoming very arrogant after the events of the Aogiri Tree arc and thinking that he can kind of essentially defeat anybody that crosses his path, and after getting a few butt kickings from Sachi, I feel like Kaneki came to terms with that. Because the way how Kaneki is represented in the second half of the Tokyo Ghoul manga, or at least after the events of the Kano Raid arc, is very different. He comes across as a lot more like his original self, even though he does seem very lost in the overall world and unsure what exactly he wants to do or where he even belongs, due to the fact that he is half ghoul and half human, and he kinda has no place in either side of the world. Kaneki slowly comes to terms that Onteku is the place that he originally wanted to be, since that was the first place that ended up accepting him. And this is proved even more in the end, where he talks to the anti-Aogiri group and even asks them whether or not they would join him in joining Onteku once again, and you even see this in the final arc of TG, the Onteku Raid arc, where he's willing to fight alongside a lot of his comrades in order to protect their lives, but ends up failing for the most part anyways. Not only does Yoshimura get taken in by Aogiri, the group that Kaneki hates the most, and never is saved throughout the course of the Tokyo Ghoul story, but you have where both Koma and Arimi are forced to live in hiding, as well as Toka and Yomo, unsure where their states are even at, for over 2 years. You even have where someone like Hinami, who Kaneki considered very precious and even a sister figure to him, ended up being taken in by Aogiri. Now, this was on her own free will, it's not like she was kidnapped, but ended up working for the group that Kaneki hated the most. And in the very end, despite us not finding out the full-on details of this until the events of Tokyo Ghoul Re, Kaneki even ended up causing his own friend to go through a horrible pain and eating part of his face as well as parts of his neck, and ended up failing to even take down Arima. Now, in the grand scheme, you could say that Hide's plan definitely did end up succeeding, which it did, in the fact that Arima did find some type of interest in Kaneki due to how hard he was fighting, but still, in the grand scheme of things, Kaneki was a failure, and you can even say the way how Tokyo Ghoul Part 1 ended was definitely one wrapped in tragedy. But either way, this is my overall thoughts of Kaneki as a character, at least the first half of them, without going too heavily in Tokyo Ghoul Re. I'll probably end up making a separate video on that as a whole. If you guys wish to see it, go ahead and hit that like button, as well as comment down below your guys' thoughts on my overall video, and I'll be sure to make a video talking more in depth about the characters of Heise Satsuki, Black Reaper Kaneki, as well as the One-Eyed King personality of Kaneki, due to the several different aspects of them and what exactly they represent to the overall story. I'm sorry that this video is completely focused on black-haired Kaneki as well as white-haired Kaneki, but due to how strongly they kind of supported the overall fundamentals of the story, I felt like that's only right for them to get their own separate videos. So anyways, thank you for watching. Remember to comment and subscribe as always, guys. I love you all. Jalen Hawk, signing out. See you guys.